Hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, Federalist number 16. We're going to be doing a live read-along where we will start from the beginning and go through the end. Federalist number 16, line by line, just reviewing each and every little thing we do along the way. Just put one more thing up. Yes, please. Here we are. Okay, so let's get to it. Wasting very little time, getting right to number 16. Thought I updated it. Not sure why it says 15 below. You know what? Let's see if we can't correct that real quick while we're here. Thought I updated that. Anyway, we are sticking with Alexander Hamilton in this particular discussion. Alexander Hamilton, of course. Oh, no. Here I go. That's what happens when I do it live. I always mess things up. Let's see. This is... Okay, well, this is not going well. What is going on here? Is it this? Is it this? Can I do this? Okay, nope. Oh, man. Well, I really messed it up, didn't I? Give me 1 second here. I did download it. Oh, that's why. It's under trivia/read-along. Let's come right back over here. And now my face is very red. Anyone popping in, just watch me mess up. Not how we wanted to start this particular episode, but that's okay. We're going to get this up here and we'll be all good. There, that was a lot of work to correct the number down below. Now we're good. Federalist number 16. Let's get to it. Okay, pull up here. Okay, well, not how I wanted to start. But anyway, Federalist number 16, the same subject continued, the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve the Union for the New York Packet, December 4th, 1787, Alexander Hamilton. So, Hamilton is continuing the discussion we had the other day. Again, criticizing the Articles of Confederation, but using it, at least in the previous one, as a piggyback to demonstrate why the United States Constitution is the only way to go. I'm going to make this a little easier for you guys to read. And that should be that. To the people of the state of New York. One sentence at a time. If this is your first time, I usually don't mess up the beginning like that. And we go sentence by sentence to really pick apart this 18th century language. Sentence number 1. The tendency of the principle of legislation for the states or communities in their political capacities, as it has been exemplified by the experiment we have made of it, is equally attested by the events which have befallen all other governments of the Confederate kind, of which we have any account, in exact proportion to its prevalence in those systems. So, just to get a little more specific, starting right off hard, talking about the governments of the states, that has been, when you look back at different confederations in the past, there are certain issues that have arisen that we can look back on. So let's take a look back. The confirmation of this fact will be worthy of a distinct and particular examination. You know what? I'm going to go back to that first sentence very quickly because it is the core of it. So let's break it down a little bit. The tendency and principle of the legislation of states and communities in their political capacities has been exemplified by the experiment we have made of it, is equally attested by the events which have befallen all other governments of the Confederate kind. Okay, so what he's saying here is, we, under the Articles of Confederation, we've run into the same issues as other confederations. So it looks like he's going to do a little history lesson in this discussion about previous confederations and how they relate to the Articles of Confederation. I, Alexander Hamilton, shall content myself with barely observing here that of all the confederacies of antiquity which history has handed down to us, the Lycian and Achaean leagues, as far as there remain vestiges of them, appear to have been most free from the fetters of that mistaken principle, and were accordingly those which have best deserved and have the most liberally received the applauding suffrages of political writers. So, essentially, the ancient nations of Lycia and Achaea, I believe it is, we don't have a lot of remaining history from them. There's not a lot we know about them, but what seems to have happened is they were very liberal and people approved them. Its contemporary political theorists approve them. Okay, one run-on sentence. This exceptionable principle may, as truly as emphatically, be styled the parent of anarchy. It has been seen that the delinquencies in the members of the Union are its natural and necessary offspring, and that wherever they happen, the only constitutional remedy is force, and the immediate effect of the use of it, civil war. So, looking at these past nations as a model, the delinquencies of the members of the Union are its natural and necessary offspring. So this particular confederacy, by its nature, has certain issues. And when these issues come to bear, the only thing that can happen is civil war. Again, in the previous one, number 15, Hamilton went into depth on some of the issues that he seems to be referencing here. It remains to inquire how far so odious an engine of government, in its application to us, would even be capable of answering its end. So, it's hard to see how a confederation of this nature will succeed. Okay. If there should not be a large army constantly at the disposal of the national government, it would either not be able to employ force at all, or, when this could be done, it would amount to a war between parts of the Confederacy concerning the infractions of a league, in which the strongest combination would be the most likely to prevail, whether it consisted of those who supported or those who resisted the general authority. So, in a confederation of this nature, I'm sure he'll get back to the Lycean stuff, but in a confederation like the Articles of Confederation, if there's not a large, powerful army to suppress disobedient states, eventually the power of force is going to be left up to the separate states, and there will be disagreements, and there will inevitably, according to him, be a civil war, probably won by the more powerful states. It would rarely happen that the delinquency to be redressed would be confined to a single member. And if there were more than one who had neglected their duty, similarly of situation would induce them to unite for a common defense. So probably it's not just going to be one state giving everyone else trouble. It's probably going to be these states over here factioning off, these states over here, and they will unite despite their inherent desire to not unite. Under the Constitution, they would inevitably unite against each other. And it's very interesting here. I'll remind you that the Civil War of the United States takes place 73 years later. So a little bit of predictions here, if you will. Okay, a pretty long one. We'll probably have to break this one down. Independent of this motive of sympathy, if a large and influential state should happen to be the aggressing member, it would commonly have weight enough with its neighbors to win over some of them as associates to its cause. Nope, it's not quite as long as I thought. So, not only will people be motivated by their agreements with other conflicting states and take sides, but if the biggest state, maybe Virginia at the time, would be the one who's like going to war for seemingly no reason, it would probably get some of its neighbors in an effort to not be invaded to say, yeah, we agree with you, we'll be on your team, no problem. Specious arguments of danger to the common liberty could easily be contrived. Plausible excuses for the deficiencies of the party could, without difficulty, be invented to alarm the apprehensions, inflame the passions, and conciliate the goodwill even of those states which were not chargeable with any violation or omission of duty. So, states could make arguments that, hey, the guy over next to you isn't good. The more powerful states could say to a semi-powerful state next to it, hey, that little guy over there, he's being real mean to you. And the second state might say he's not really being that mean to me, but the big state could be like, yeah, he is. We're going to war with him. A lot of long sentences this time. This would be more likely to take place as the delinquencies of the larger members might be expected sometimes to proceed from an ambitious premeditation in their rulers, with a view of getting rid of all external control upon their designs of personal aggrandizement, the better to effect which it is presumable they would tamper beforehand with leading individuals in the adjacent states. Breaking that down. The big state will probably do something like this because everyone wants power, and a bigger state that has power is going to want to keep its power and expand it. And they are not only going to want to prohibit their neighbors from limiting their power, but they will actually say, first of all, they'll tamper quietly in their neighboring states, saying, come on, hang out with us. But they will find reasons to, as he uses the word tamper, he will find reasons to invade less powerful states just to accumulate more power for themselves. If associates could not be found at home, recourse would be had to the aid of foreign powers, who would seldom be disinclined to encouraging the dissensions of a confederacy from the firm union which they had so much to fear. So, if they can't get the little guy next to him to join hands, they'll just go over to Europe, find someone else with power to come help them suppress their neighbors. When the sword is once drawn, the passions of men observe no bounds of moderation. Okay, that's a really fun line, actually. So, once wars start, reason is usually tossed out the window. The suggestions of wounded pride, the instigations of irritated resentment, would be apt to carry the states against which the arms of the Union were exerted to any extremes necessary to avenge the affront or to avoid the disgrace of submission. So the little states that are getting attacked and or might be defending from their neighboring states would do literally anything to maintain their independence because of, like you said, their wounded pride, irritated resentment, that's pretty funny, and the disgrace of losing. The first war of this kind would probably terminate in a dissolution of the Union. So the first time states go to war with each other, the Union's done. Now, I do want to say right off the bat, there was a little bit of a skirmishy war between Connecticut and Pennsylvania in the Wyoming Valley in what is now northeastern Pennsylvania. It was one of a series of wars called the Yankee-Pennamite Wars. And the last one did occur just after the Revolutionary War ends. That one was very minor, but still, it didn't end in the dissolution of the Union. Sorry, Hamilton. Had to throw that out there. This may be considered as the... real quick, just to summarize here. He made that brief reference to ancient history. He must have assumed his contemporaries would have understood those particular nations. For the most part, it's very interesting because the last paper is speaking pretty eloquently. Again, Hamilton speaking pretty eloquently about the dangers of the Confederacy and issues it's causing and why the Constitution would be good at replacing that. So far in this one, he's taken a much more aggressive, like, the Confederacy is going to end in civil war approach. He went from... It's really interesting how Hamilton does this. He goes from very kind of reasonable, let's think this through and talk about it, to fear. Like, I know, as I love to mention, they're all propaganda. These are political think pieces written specifically to sway public opinion. They are, by definition, propaganda. And it's very interesting how Hamilton jumps back and forth in the type of propaganda he throws out there. So I just found that interesting. And this is only 3 days later, by the way. This may be considered as the violent death of the Confederacy. So, yes, if a war breaks out between the states, it is definitely a violent end to the Confederacy. Fact. Its more natural death is what we now seem to be on the point of experiencing, if the federal system be not speedily renovated in a more substantial form. So, that's the violent death. Chances are it's going to have a more natural death than violence, and that's what Hamilton is really concerned with. It is not probable, considering the genius of this country, that the complying states would often be inclined to support the authority of the Union by engaging in a war against the non-complying states. So, just to clarify, if one state wants to go to war against other states, most of the states in the Union are not going to join it. So, thanks for reading before, because that's probably not going to happen, I guess. They would always be more ready to pursue the milder course of putting themselves upon an equal footing with the delinquent members by an imitation of their example. So this is where it's going to get good. Again, the real core where that whole, like, we're probably going to go to war with each other started, even though he diverged to, like, the big states might just go to war randomly, he started with, they're going to, the problem is states are being delinquent, and if states are being delinquent, then you might have to go to war to, as he said, you need a big army to enforce your laws. Here he's saying, the better chance is if one state's not paying its bills, the other states are going to say, I don't want to pay my bills either. And the guilt of all would thus become the security of all. So, the guilt of all thus become the security of all. They'd be, not like I feel guilty. They'd actually, they're guilty of the crime of being delinquent. And we'd all be insecure because we're not able to fund any defenses. Our past experience has exhibited the operations of this spirit in full light. I'm sorry. You know you read a lot of 18th century language when you read the word has and you naturally want to say hath? Okay. Our past experience hath exhibited the operation of this spirit in full light. So look at what's happening in the Continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation. This is what's happening. People just aren't paying their bills, and other states are saying they're not paying, I'm not going to pay either. There would, in fact, be an insuperable difficulty in ascertaining when force could, with propriety, be employed. So, because there are separate states, just really simply in a league of friendship meant to defend each other from exterior threats, when to punish a state for it being delinquent is going to be very difficult. People are not going to know when to come together and decide to essentially invade one of the states that are not paying their bills. Repossess that state, I guess you could say. In the article of pecuniary contribution, which would be the most usual source of delinquency, it would often be impossible to decide whether it had proceeded from disinclination or inability. So, article of pecuniary contribution. So when someone's not paying their bills, it's going to be tough to know if they just are blowing them off or if they just don't have the money. Those are two significantly different situations. The pretense of the latter would always be at hand. So even states that say, I don't want to, could put on a show and say, we can't. Nah, we can't do it. We just don't have the money. It's not that we don't want to. We definitely want to. We just can't right now. Could happen again, and this is when the Continental Congress is deciding which state needs to be invaded by the collective army that they don't have. That again, Hamilton said we don't have anyway. When we need to invade one of the states to punish it for not paying its bills, and determining if they're doing it on purpose or no fault of their own. And the case must be very flagrant, in which its fallacy could be detected with sufficient certainty to justify the harsh expedient of compulsion. So the case must be very flagrant. So they have to literally walk in the Continental Congress and be like, no, we're not paying. Basically what Rhode Island was doing at the time is what he's talking about here. It is easy to see this problem alone, as often it should occur, would open a wide field for the exercise of factious views of partiality and of oppression in the majority that happened to prevail in the National Council. So it's obviously, in this situation, it's going to be very difficult because it's going to be easy for the Confederation to do terrible things to smaller states because one or two small states lie and you catch them, now you don't know who to trust, and it could be bad for smaller states that are trying to pay their bills and simply can't. It seems to require no pains to prove that the states ought not to prefer a national constitution which could only be kept in motion by the instrumentality of a large army continually on foot to execute the ordinary requisitions or decrees of the government. So, seems obvious to me, Alexander Hamilton, I'm Alexander Hamilton now, seems obvious to me that everyone should prefer a national constitution, where a big army can come into any state and take the money that it has demanded of the state. It may surprise many conservatives in the audience, which I love this audience because wide political background watching. It may surprise everyone, especially the conservatives, that a standing army is very much one of the main reasons the United States Constitution was written. And that is what Hamilton is arguing for right now. That's where he's gotten here. We need a standing army to go into states who are disobeying what the government says. And yet this plain alternative, involved by those who wish to deny it the power of extending its operations to individuals. This is the plain alternative involved by those who wish to deny the power of extending its operations to individuals. I'm not entirely sure what he means extending the operations to individuals. Let's read through the next sentence, see if we can put a little perspective on it. Such a scheme, if practicable at all, would instantly degenerate into military despotism, but it will be found in every light impracticable. Oh, okay, let me read this again. This is probably the most challenging read so far that we've done. Such a scheme, if practicable at all, would instantly degenerate into military despotism, but it will be found in every light impracticable. So, it's obvious to him we need a large army on foot to go into the states if they have to. This is the plain alternative involved by those who wish to deny it the power of its extent. So, So this is what everyone's complaining about. Anti-Federalists are saying, no, we can't have. It will extend its power over individuals. It will come take people. Such a scheme, if practicable at all, would instantly degenerate into military despotism. So he's acknowledging that, like, yes, if we were going to take individuals, then it would be despotism. But it's just, that's never going to happen. In every light impracticable. That can't happen. Why not? The resources of the Union would not be equal to the maintenance of an army considerable enough to confine the larger states within the limits of their duty, nor would the means ever be furnished of forming such an army in the first place. So, they just couldn't have enough people to go in and take over the larger states and subordinate every citizen in the larger states, mind you, nor would they have the means of doing it. So under the national government, under the Constitution, the Senate and House of Representatives would never raise enough money to send an army to take Virginia. Isn't that comforting? All right, let's finish up here. Whoever considers the populousness and strength of several of these states singly at the present juncture and looks forward to what they will become even at the distance of half a century will at once dismiss the idle and visionary any scheme which aims to regulate their movements by laws to operate upon them in their collective capacities and to be exerted by coercion applicable to them in the same capacities. Blah. So many words. So, when you look at how big some of these states is and how strong they are both financially and their militias, though side note, the federal government can take over the militia in this Constitution, but putting that aside, apparently, they will be able, there's basically no way that the federal government could enforce something that they wholeheartedly deny. And this is something the anti-federalists talk about a lot, is, the states have very little power. They have little recourse against the government. The government can just send the army here and take over the state militias and tell us what to do. And he's saying it's Hamilton's saying that's not possible now, and because the states are only going to grow and get more populated and more wealthy, it's going to get even harder. A project of this kind is little less romantic than the monster-taming spirit which is attributed to the fabulous heroes and demigods of antiquity. So you'd have to be, Alexander the Great, or not even like someone, even heroic soldiers from the past are eluding me. Apparently not a George Washington, because you very specifically could have referenced that, but name a founder from antiquity, or a hero from antiquity. You'd need someone like that. Take a quick sip of water here. Oh, spilled it. Even in those confederacies which have been composed of members smaller than many of our counties, the principle of legislation for sovereign states supported by military coercion has never been found effectual. So, even if you look through history, many of the ancient Greek city-states were smaller than counties, as he says. The principle of legislation for sovereign states supported by military coercion has never been found effectual. So the idea that you make a law and no one wants the law, but you enforce it with the military, just doesn't work. I mean, granted, he did not see the 20th century, where it kind of worked. It has rarely been attempted to be employed, but against the weaker members, and in most instances attempts to coerce the refractory and disobedient, have been the signals of bloody wars in which one half of the Confederacy has displayed its banners against the other half. So, very rarely has someone actually tried to make laws that, in a confederacy, again, he's talking specifically about confederacies. So very rarely in a confederacy of nations or a confederacy of states have the attempt to make laws that a bunch of the states didn't want and then just go invade them and demand they do the laws. That never works. And in most instances, usually when you try and do that, civil wars erupt and people fight to stop it. And that's it. So civil wars erupt. So I guess he's predicting that, worst case scenario, civil war. Anyway, which is what he was predicting if you stay under the Constitution anyway. Okay. The result of these observations to an intelligent mind must be clearly this, that if it be possible at any rate to construct a federal government capable of regulating the common concerns and preserving the general tranquility, it must be founded as to the objects of committed to its care, upon the reverse of the principle contended for by opponents of the proposed Constitution. So there's a triple negative in there. Hold on. The results of these... So if you're a smart person, listening to what I have to say, Alexander Hamilton, that if it be possible at any rate to construct a federal government capable of regulating these concerns for the general tranquility, it must be founded... So if we want to create... Any reasonable person will realize that if we want to create a government that can help the general tranquility, to keep the peace, to make this a fun, happy, wonderful place to live, it must be founded on objects committed to its care, upon the reverse of the principles contended for by the opponents of the preserved Constitution. The reverse of what being opposed. He's really coming at us this time. So, basically what he's saying here is if we want a government that actually works, we need to come together under the Constitution. The anti-federalists are not trying to commit to the care of the Union. They are being selfish and only committing to the care of their locality, their states. It must carry its agency to the persons of the citizens. So this government must not... How do I say this? Not just go through the states, not just demand the states do what we want and then come invade the states, because that's never going to get the people themselves on board. That will lead to revolutions and civil war. The government needs to... The people need to want to obey the government. And right now the states don't want to obey the Articles of Confederation, and therefore the people don't want to. It must stand in need of no intermediate legislations, but it must itself be empowered to employ the arm of the ordinary magistrate to execute its own resolutions. So we can't have, he's basically calling the Articles of Confederation, an intermediate legislation. Kind of an advisor making recommendations. What we need, he's implying, is one government that makes its laws and enforces them. He's not even implying it, he's saying it outright. The majesty of the national authority must be manifested through the medium of the courts of justice. So we use courts to have the national government's authority be appropriately instituted. The government of the Union, like that of each state, must be able to address itself immediately to the hopes and fears of individuals and to attract to its support those passions which have the strongest influence upon the human heart. Like I was saying before, we need the people to want to obey the laws. It must, in short, possess all the means and have a right to resort to all the methods of executing the powers with which it is entrusted, that are possessed and exercised by the governments of the particular states. So, again, we need we need one government that can actually do what it says it's going to do and what it's supposed to do. To this reasoning, it may perhaps be objected that if any state should be disaffected to the authority of the Union, it could at any time obstruct the execution of its laws, and bring the matter to the same issue of force with the necessity of which the opposite scheme is reproached. So if any one state doesn't like what's happening under the Articles of Confederation, they can just vote no on everything and obstruct it. And if there's a important segment of any government that just votes no, then the government grinds to a halt and cannot do anything. And this, he's saying, yeah, could bring the same issue as force. This also would lead to a civil war, or at least an invasion. Oh, well, earlier he was saying that we sometimes under the Articles we might have to invade a disobedient state. So he's like reflecting back on that. It's a very long sentence, so we'll probably have to reflect. We'll probably have to go back through it. The plausibility of this objection will vanish the moment we avert to the essential difference between a mere non-compliance and a direct and active resistance. Oh, it is just one sentence. Okay, well, there's that. I'm going to take a sip of water real quick. So, these are his capitals, not mine. The plausibility of this objection will vanish the moment we avert to the essential difference between non-compliance and direct and active resistance. This is what he was speaking about earlier. He's basically going back to what he initially said, which was, if a state can't pay its bills, that's different than a state that just doesn't want to pay its bills. And it's very difficult to determine which one it is, because a state that doesn't want to pay its bills could just be like, we can't. We want to, but we can't. All right, wow, I'm just really running past sentences here. If the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only to not to act, or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated. So if a state just does nothing, that's the same thing as voting no. This neglect of duty may be distinguished. This neglect of duty may be disguised under affected but unsubstantial provisions, so as not to appear, and of course not to excite any alarm in the people for fear of the safety of the Constitution. Again, I'm skipping all the periods this time. Weird sentence with all these capital letters. This neglect of duty may be disguised under affected but unsubstantiated provisions, so as not to appear, of course, not to excite alarm in the people for the fear of the safety of the Constitution. So, as he said earlier, states will pretend they want to pay their bills and just say, we just can't right now. The state leaders may even make a merit of their surreptitious invasions of it on the ground of some temporary convenience, exception, or advantage. So they'll find excuses. All right. But if the execution of the laws of the national government should not require the intervention of the state legislatures, if they were to pass into immediate operation upon the citizens themselves, the particular governments could not interrupt their progress without an open and violent exertion of an unconstitutional power. So, if we have the Constitution, the national government can make a law and the people have to obey it. And the states are just kind of there in the middle. I know Madison keeps trying to say it's both federal and state, both federal and confederated. But here Hamilton's saying we need the federal government to be able to just make laws for the states. It's also interesting he's begun calling it a national government. It took Hamilton a while to start calling it a national government. Because, the states would have to start an unconstitutional civil war if they disobeyed the federal government. No omissions nor evasions would answer the end. So they couldn't, the states couldn't just not do anything to prohibit the federal government, as they were doing under the Articles of Confederation, from acting. They would be obliged to act, and in such a manner as would leave no doubt that they had encroached on the national rights. So they have to do something, and if it was against what the federal government said, they're breaking the law. An experiment of this nature would always be hazardous in the face of a constitution in any degree competent to its own defense, and of a people enlightened enough to distinguish between a legal exercise and an illegal usurpation of authority. Excuse me very much. So if they were to try and stop the federal government, they can't. It would be illegal, and it would be against the will of the people. The success of it would require not merely a factious majority in the legislature, but the concurrence of the courts of justice and the body of the people. So it's not like a state government could just go and do this. They would also need the state courts and the people of the state to all come together to disobey the federal government. If the judges were not embarked in a conspiracy with the legislature, they would pronounce the resolutions of such a majority to be contrary to the supreme law of the land, unconstitutional and void. So under the Constitution, if the state governments try and not pay the taxes that the federal government demands they pay, then the courts would say, no, that's unconstitutional, and tell the legislatures to pay them. Although he does have one note here, if they were not embarked in a conspiracy with the legislatures. So, a little bit of, there's little hints at the Civil War. It's interesting. Reading this, you kind of have to, us in present day, need to keep in mind the Civil War. Because he's basically outlining why the Constitution, when it came to collecting resources, would prevent a civil war. And yet, just 70 years later, most of what he's saying is proven wildly false. If the people were not tainted with the spirit of their state representatives, they, as the natural guardians of the Constitution, would throw their weight into the national scale and give it a decided preponderance in the contest. So, he's saying the people are the natural guardians. So it's up to the people. If a state does this, it would be the people's fault themselves that their leaders are making these decisions. Love to throw it down at the lower classes. Some things never change. It's the common people's fault that the leaders are doing terrible things. Okay. No politics here. No modern politics. It's hard. It's hard to leave modern politics out when we're talking about the foundation of our government. So applaud me for doing so. Anyway, attempts of this kind would not often be made with levity or rashness, because they could seldom be made without danger to the authors, unless cases of a tyrannical exercise of federal authority. Okay, so because of this situation, the states would very rarely even try to. First of all, in the last sentence, I forgot to mention, he does note that the people themselves who are responsible for keeping the state governments in line, they would probably join the federal army anyway. And here he's saying attempts of this kind, attempts of the state to try and not pay their bills would seldom be made unless without dangers to the authors. So the people making these decisions might get in a lot of trouble, because that's treasonous under the Constitution. Not a word he uses, an implication he's throwing out there, unless in cases of a tyrannical exercise of federal authority. So, in case the federal government does get a tyrant, well, then it wouldn't be a big deal. Just throwing that out there. And it's really interesting how he puts that out there so briefly, because there are anti-federalists galore just donating entire papers to how this is going to lead to a tyrannical government. And he says, in that, unless that happens, I will say he gets more into that in later papers, to be fair to Hamilton. If opposition to the national government should arise from the disorderly conduct of refractory or seditious individuals, it could be overcome by the same means which are daily employed against the same evil in the state governments. So it's not even later papers. He gets into it here. If there is a tyrannical executive taking over, you have the same dangers in the state governments as you do in the federal government, and it operates in much the same measure to make sure that doesn't happen. The magistracy, being equally the ministers of the law of the land from whatever source it might emanate, would doubtless be as ready to guard the national as the local regulations from the inroads of private licentiousness. So, whoever's in charge, be it state government, federal government, they would doubtless be as ready to, so they would be more ready, people would be more ready to defend their local communities than the larger whole. Where does this sentence end? As to those partial commotions and insurrections which sometimes disquiet society from the intrigues of an inconsiderable faction, or from sudden or occasioned ill humors that did not infect the great body of the community, the general government could command more extensive resources for the suppression of disturbances of that kind than would be in the power of any single member. So, Shays' Rebellion. He's pretty specifically referencing Shays' Rebellion right here. Although there were other ones that broke out. Not the Pine Tree Riots. The Paper Money Riots in New Hampshire. There were uprisings in Pennsylvania. A lot of veterans came home and found themselves in debt and didn't have... Literally, there was no money. They couldn't sell anything because there was no money for people to buy things with. So they were getting foreclosed on because there was no money. And they started little rebellions there. And he's referencing things like that. When these happen, it's tough for the state governments to suppress a rebellion of that nature. The federal government, we have resources across the nation that we can bring together to go into a state and suppress a rebellion if it can't do it itself. Okay. And as to those mortal feuds which, in certain conjectures, spread a conflagration of a whole nation, or through a very large proportion of it, proceeding either from weighty causes of discontent given by the government, or from the contagion of some violent popular paroxysm, they do not fall within any ordinary rules of calculation. So, this is him wiping his brow of the Civil War. I don't know how to say it. He's preemptively taking blame away from the Constitution for something like the Civil War. These mortal feuds, these gigantic uprisings through a whole nation or most of a nation, from weighty causes of discontent given by the government or popular. So basically, when a government really goes bad and everyone's angry, or when there are some smooth talkers that make people angry, and a gigantic civil war across the Union breaks out, those don't fall within any rules of calculation. So there's nothing we can do about those. Sometimes just everyone goes to war. And he's no longer talking about the Articles of Confederation. Here, he is talking about a national government. He is talking about under the Constitution. If there was a major civil war, well, that just kind of happens sometimes. When they happen, they commonly amount to revolutions and dismemberment of empires. So, the whole thing is going to fall apart eventually anyway. No form of government can always either avoid or control them. It is in vain hope to guard against events too mighty for human foresight or precaution, and it would be idle to object to a government because it could not perform impossibilities. Publius. a very interesting ending there where he's like, well, you know, we can't not have this government because it might go terribly wrong someday. Like, that's essentially his argument. You know, anti-federalists out here saying, oh, we might get, you know, it might lead to tyranny and dictatorship. He brushes that off in like one or two sentences in the middle. Like, maybe. And then he says, you know, when the people at large, because it's the people's fault. This is the people's constitution, right? It's definitely not just a few, you know, 55 people who met in secret for a summer. And I'm not trying to talk trash about the Constitution. I like to talk trash about Hamilton. It's a lot of fun. This paper is fascinating. I will bring myself back up here real quick. Light myself back up. This paper is fascinating because, first of all, it's super hard to read. If you've been watching, obviously, this is the one I had the most trouble literally reading out loud compared to the other ones. He does a lot of like double, triple negatives in it. That's tough. It's also fascinating because, as I said before, he goes from well-reasoned, cool, calm discourse to fear, 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 fear at the beginning of this one. Basically, to sum up, the Articles of Confederation is not working appropriately because some people aren't paying their taxes. If you have several states in confederation, and you're trying to raise revenue from them, you need an army that can demand it from them. And if they refuse to pay, you need to send that army in to take it. Under the Articles of Confederation, if one state just says, one state says they can't pay, you have to decide whether or not to go take it anyway. It's going to be difficult to determine if a state actually cannot pay, or if it can pay and it's just saying, no, we don't have the money, when they obviously do. At that point, a government has to go in and take it. Now, assuming you agree with his principle there, then you would pretty easily be swayed to the opinion of the Constitution, because Hamilton's saying we need an army to go take it, and the national government would give us that army. We can go in. States might protest this kind of thing, but the people, we need to have the people want to obey the laws, so we'll only make laws the people will want to obey, because it would be impossible for us to go in and suppress all of the people in all of the states. So the only issue we're coming to is if the state governments, elected by the people, sure, but the state governments don't want to pay the apportioned revenue that the government demands. Therefore, when the federal government has to go in and take that money that it has demanded, the state government, the people will more than likely join the federal government in their charge against the state governments. Unless, of course, as he says, there's some conspiracy between the judges and the state legislatures, and the people are a part of it. He also says that if that happens, there's just nothing you can do about it. I'm sure there's a bunch of things I'm leaving out. It was a pretty long paper. It was fairly long. Where are we at now? I don't know how long. We've been doing this a while. Don't know how long. Doesn't matter. They are, yeah. And that, my friends, is why we need a standing army. That is why, according to Alexander Hamilton, in the Federalist Papers, the United States Constitution is permitted to create a standing army. It's a very common misconception nowadays that the founders didn't want a standing army. A gigantic section of the founders didn't want a standing army. 49.5% of the founders didn't want a standing army. Just enough. Heck, I might even be more than that. But there were enough people persuaded to the Constitution to make it happen. That's why we had it. And the Constitution, as I think we've read before, but we'll definitely read in the future. I know I've read it in anti-federalist papers. I'm sure we'll read it in other papers. The Constitution can come in and take the state militias. It's actually interesting. I I believe it was the Impartial Examiner, an anti-federalist author, who wrote, you say that you talk about the state militias in the Constitution, but you don't talk about posse comitatus, which is literally calling out the posse. I know you usually think Wild West with that, but no. Impartial Examiner was saying you should at least let local officials be able to call in their own soldiers, right? But granted, he was talking more about for local issues, for police force enforcement and stuff of that nature. So that is Federalist number 16. It was a mouthful. I certainly had a fun time reading it and learning about it with you. I hope you feel the same. Probably my personal opinions are showing through reading this particular paper while I do the Bill Clinton for some reason. But you make up your own mind. As I said, don't like to talk about modern politics. I try and be unbiased. The reason I come at it with a little bit of an angle of really is because I read so many of the anti-federalist papers also, so I've seen both sides. So it's easy for me at this point to be to argue against whatever I'm reading, as opposed to be like, yeah, this is great. I guess I'm a little bit of a contrarian in that fashion. But thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. I know you did. I will be back. These are live right now on YouTube. I am going to start, I think with number 20, doing them live on my Patreon, and then uploading them to YouTube afterwards. So if you are interested in coming live, commenting, and reacting with me in real time, do me a favor and check out the Patreon page. You will enjoy many of the offerings there. And I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.